Hello everyone, my name is Julian. I'm an engineer with CADtools, and today we're here to talk about what we can do to really get the most out of our dimensions using the CADdimensions panel. So to get started, let's get that panel open. We're going to select Window, and then CADtools, and then finally CADdimensions. With this open, I want to first talk about the preview section at the top of the panel. The preview section is a convenience feature for you to basically, if you don't already have a dimension drawn on your artboard anywhere and you don't necessarily want to be drawing experimental dimensions somewhere on your artboard, it's a tool for you to be able to see the changes that you are making across all the settings in the dimensions panel without actually having to interact with a dimension that is already on your artboard. So that is to say, for instance, if we were to change the Terminator style, you will see that the Terminator style changed in this preview section. What that means is that the next dimension you draw will look like what you can see here in the preview section. Alternatively, if you do already have a dimension drawn, you of course can see that represented in both places as you update those changes. So for instance, as we cycle through these Terminator styles, you'll see that those are changing not only in the preview area, but also in the artboard itself. From there, we can talk about the general section. The general section is probably what you would refer to as maybe some of the broad strokes that you can apply to the dimensions panel. So for instance, we can look at this format area, and the format is what you can basically expect to see represented across the span of the dimension that you are interacting with. So for instance, we're currently looking at it represented as a measurement. We have the option to have an alphabetically incrementally label system. Similarly, we also have a numerically incrementing labeling system. Finally, we also have the ability to just render custom text across the span of the dimension, like so. As with all things in CADtools, we have the ability to click the More button here. If you see a More button, it basically means that you have the ability to apply some more granular control over whatever it is next to. In this particular case, we are looking at basically the alphabetical and the numerical incrementing systems, a little bit of fine tuning there. And then I don't want to say more importantly, but also you have the ability to manipulate the custom text to change whatever is going to render if you are doing a custom text format. Moving around here, we have the color section. The color section is basically the color you would like to see all of your dimension lines rendered as. It will not affect the text. It is just the lines and the Terminators. And then finally, we have this detach button. Detach is something that you can use to basically detach the dimension from your artwork and also unload it from the rest of the dimensions panel. So what that is to say, for instance, if we try to move this dimension, you can see that it snaps right back to the artwork. It is very much connected to the artwork. And then of course, as we make changes, you will see those reflected as it is attached. If I click the detach button, that is no longer true. None of the settings I make will have any effect on the artwork itself, or excuse me, on the dimension itself, because it is detached. It no longer has a state as a dimension. As probably like a quick aside to that, anytime you click a dimension, that dimension is going to hold basically a snapshot of its own memory state, however it was configured in the dimensions panel. So if you see me click between these two dimensions, you'll notice that the Terminator style changes. So every time you click on a dimension, it is basically going to be a snapshot of what dimension that was, even if it's not something that necessarily applies. Okay, Terminators. We kind of had a brief little preview of the Terminators since I was using those as examples while we were moving around things like the preview pane. However, I think let's just kind of take it from the top real quick. We have the option to just turn them off entirely with that checkbox right there. And then once you have that done, you have the option to kind of just fine tune those Terminator styles. So for instance, we change this the stroke weight to 3, then you will see that represented in the Terminator. It should be noted that some of the Terminator styles are basically objects without a stroke. So if we go to this style, you'll notice that there is no stroke to apply on there. So if you're making that change and it doesn't look right, it might be because you just have a different Terminator style selected. The length of the Terminator is what it sounds like. It's going to be the length of the line that we use to draw the Terminator. And then finally, we have the angle of the Terminator we can draw as well. Okay, last thing to mention in the Terminator section is where we are going to place the dimension in respect to the witness lines. So right now we have best side, which is basically allowing CAD tools to look at your artwork and the dimension being drawn and decide the best place to stuff that dimension information, which in this particular case just happens to be on the inside. We can also render it on the outside of the dimension span. So that's what that stuff looks like. All right, text is up next. Where to start with the text section? So this is probably one of the larger sections of the dimensions panel. The top half is all things that you would expect to see, which is basically the font picker and the font manipulation. So font picker, we also have, of course, the font color, we have font size, and then hidden in the little more menu is access to the finer character manipulations that you would see in native character panels across all of Illustrator. So things like text kerning, vertical space, things like that will be hidden in that little more context menu. So moving down, we have this set of buttons right here. So what that is referring to is how we are going to basically render the text in relationship to the dimension that is being drawn. So right now we are looking at that dimension with an inline text. So the text is inside or within the dimension line itself. Anytime we have text rendered that way, we have inline spacing, which will adjust the padding around the text inside of that dimension. We also have above line rendering. So above line does exactly what it sounds like. It's going to render that text above the line. And then in times like that, we have the ability to adjust our above line spacing, which is controlled with this little text field right there. If we are looking in the vertical space, we have a couple more options. So anytime we are looking at the vertical line, we can do inline, which is what we're looking at here. We also have the option to render the text on the horizontal axis while the dimension runs vertically. And then, of course, we have the ability to not only run inline text one direction, but we can also run it the other direction, kind of, the orientation it is facing. Same is true with above text, or above the line representations in the vertical axis. Moving down, we do have something to talk about with the inclined lines. And in this case, here's an inclined line, again, representing that in an inline representation. We have a similar option to what we did with the vertical space, where we render the text again horizontally, but the dimension runs on the incline. And then oops, clicked off of there. Finally, we have the option to actually just render the text above the line on the incline, but it only faces this one direction. It will always sit on top, as it were. So that's what we've got for those. Let's go back up here to the straight up and down, easy dimensions. And we already talked about inline spacing and box text go a little bit hand in hand here. So we've got the ability to adjust our padding, and that padding is basically the definition of where we would like to place a box around our text. If we do a box text when we don't have inline selected, then of course you're going to be using the distance above line to dictate where you would like the box drawn. And then also, again, inline spacing will also apply to the box in this particular paradigm. So kind of configure it however you would like. Of course, we have fill color, so you can adjust the fill color of the box should you be choosing to use one. And let's also go down here finally to some ellipses. So on an ellipses, we have the option to either not include or include some notation symbols. So of course, if we choose to do those, then we have the option of either rendering those before or after the dimension itself. Of course, the same holds true when we're talking about a radius. It is not only true for diameters. So of course, you have that option on both of those. And the last thing to mention as far as in the text section is concerned is free sliding text. So I'm going to grab the universal dimension tool over here, and then we're going to select this free sliding text box. And then as I draw out a dimension, we are going to hit the control key, and that will snap my dimension in the dead center of it. Again, this is with the free sliding text checked. If I let go of control, it allows me to slide that text around. And then again, control snaps it to the center, which is what we've been looking at so far. The inverse is also true. And that is if I don't have free sliding text selected, when I draw out those dimensions, they will always be in the center. And then if I hit Control, it will then allow you to slide that text around. All right, moving right along, let's talk about dimension lines real fast. Dimension lines and witness lines, actually. So you'll notice that on both of these, there is a weight category, which is going to function just like the ones in Terminators. It is none other than the stroke weight. So I'm not going to go over that because it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to grab the dimension tool real quick here, and let's talk about snap size. So you'll notice that my snap right now is quite large at 1/2 inch. And anytime I'm holding down Shift while I'm drawing a dimension, you're going to be beholden to that snap size. Alternatively, if we change this one, you're going to see a much smaller snap size. So that's how the snaps function. Extension line. If we check this and let's make a big old extension line, that's what that looks like. And then, of course, we have witness lines, which is the top of what we just looked at. We'll make it big for conversation's sake, and then put it right back. And then finally, let's talk about the gap. The gap is the area between the object that you are dimensioning and then the dimension itself. So for this gap, let's change this to 0.1, and you'll see that it pretty much almost runs directly into the object that we're dimensioning. Although if we put it at 0.5, you'll notice that the gap size cannot eclipse the snap size. So in this case, 0.5 is larger than, of course, 0.25, and such it doesn't delete the entire witness line. It just takes the witness line all the way up to the dimension line level. Last couple things to cover: diameter dimensions and chain dimensions. So to talk about diameter dimensions, obviously we're going to need something with a diameter. So we'll go down to our trusty ellipses over here. The first thing to talk about would be whether or not we want to have a dimension spanning the circle. So that is the first obvious choice we have here. And the only thing we talk about is the extension leader, which is going to be the distance from that diameter dimension to where the actual dimension text starts. So to illustrate that, we'll make this one a little bit shorter, and you can see that change size. Finally, we can talk about chain dimensions. So chain dimensions, to do that, let's grab the vertical chain dimension tool, and I will arbitrarily pull a dimension here. So we have some chain dimensions now. And we have the option to use the JIS Terminator, which is the Japanese industrial standard. So if you know you need it, obviously it's there. And if you just like the look of it, then it's also there. That's what it looks like. It's a yes or no, pretty simple. And that pretty much concludes everything that we have to talk about for the dimensions panel today. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you learned something, and we will see you next time. Ciao.